Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today, I would like to introduce you to the wonderful father-daughter painter pair, Heysen Heysen and Norah Heysen. They're two Australian artists that I just love. And I thought I would take this opportunity to introduce you to this grand love affair of mine. Heysen Heysen was a German migrant who migrated out to Australia in the late 19th century. And understandably, being a German migrant, when he came to Australia, he was most attracted to what was then known as the colony of South Australia, around the Adelaide region, right down there in the south of Australia. Because it was a colony that was very known for its German migrants. There was lots of wine growing up in the Barossa Valley, and there was a very, very strong German presence in the South Australian colony. So Hans, when he arrived in Australia, moved to Adelaide, where he built for his family a lovely house that just kept getting bigger and bigger. He was a very practical, interesting person, and he called his house the Cedars. And Heysen very quickly discovered that not only was he very interested with painting, but he was very good at it. And Heysen Heysen is credited in Australia, believe it or not. He's a much loved Australian painter, much loved in the Australian canon. But he discovered that he was very, very good at painting, in particular, landscapes. And what he became particularly well known for, believe it or not, was for painting gum trees. He just painted gum tree after gum tree after gum tree. He loved that rugged, dry, brilliance. Their ability to survive in such hot, dry environments. A lot of people don't realize that Australia is actually the driest inhabited continent on our planet. It is a very, very dry place, with much desert, arid and semi-arid, very complicated, very fragile ecosystems. And Heysen Heysen, he loved going on long road trips. He bought himself like a little bus with a little caravan on the back, believe it or not. And he would just go on these long trips through outback South Australia, painting wherever he went. And as I said, he particularly loved painting Australian native trees and desert, arid and semi-arid landscapes. That's what he became known for. And he invented this school of gum tree painting. He's actually made it very difficult for people like me to do art. I still love him to bits, but he's made my life quite difficult. Because the average Australian today, they still just want every painting to be of gum trees or of deserts, showing that perseverance, that quality of strength to survive in difficult circumstances. They just love it, and they won't accept abstract painting or anything different, of course. Likewise with poetry, my particular art form. Heysen Heysen's school of gum tree painting went hand in hand, of course, with the bush ballad tradition of writing poetry. And yes, the average Australian today, they really want all their paintings to be of gum trees or of deserts, and they really want all of their poetry to be rhyming bush ballads. It makes it very difficult when you're a contemporary artist. Of course, things are changing. Australia is now a very complex, very, inclusive, warm, welcoming place. There are many ways of being a poet and a painter in Australia today. But I guess in the popular imagination, what people really hanker for are paintings of desert landscapes and of gum trees and of rhyming bush ballads, none of which I am particularly attracted to. Despite this, I do love Hans Heysen. He was a really interesting, he was a very forceful, very magnetic character. As I said, he is still a much loved painter in the tradition in Australia. He died, of course, a long time ago now. As I said, he migrated to the colony of Adelaide in South Australia there in the late 19th century. So before World War I, the family were already settled here in the colony of South Australia. He obviously had a very loving, very nurturing relationship with his daughter, Norah Heysen, as well. They were clearly very much in love with one another. They did love each other. He was very nurturing of Norah. But like many fathers, and I've probably made this mistake myself, like many fathers, he was very concerned, very conventional, very conservative. He certainly wanted certain things for the young Norah as she was growing up. And when she discovered that she too loved painting and was also rather good at it, they had this demarcation of party lines, if you like. Hans was already established as this very famous landscape painter. He just won prize after prize. In Australia, there's a very famous prize for landscape painting, called the Win. And he won the Win Prize. He has won the Win Prize more than any artist in the history of Australian art. He just won the Win Prize for landscape painting year after year after year. So there was this demarcation of party lines, if you like. And Norah, as she grew up and started to move into her own painting practice, to try and find some space away from her father, to get away from his shadow, because he was just so famous in Australia, she went to painting still life. And in particular, as you can see from this beautiful painting, she did lots of floral arrangements, so lots of still life paintings, particularly of vases of flowers like this. Very beautiful, richly, very colourful, very lyrical paintings. They're beautiful things to look at. And then, of course, she also moved more and more into portraiture. And she, in fact, won once the very famous Australian Portraiture Prize, the Archibald Prize, which is the most famous prize for a single painting in Australia. And Norah Heysen, won that prize. So, in a sense, to get away from her father's shadow, she went into still life and portraiture, leaving Dad to continue painting his gum trees and deserts. But they did have very clearly, it was a very loving relationship. Norah obviously really struggled with the shadow, working in the shadow of her father. It must have been very, very difficult for Norah. Norah became a portrait artist, for example, a war painter during World War II. And that really was a problem for Hans. He really didn't approve of his daughter moving into this independent, vibrant, painterly life, and he really worried about her in terms of that independence and what decisions she should make or might make. He was obviously a very conservative, very conventional man. He was a beautiful, loving man. He really nurtured Norah, and they had a very close relationship, but clearly there were tensions as well. The sort of thing that Hans was able to come up with, if you can see that, that's a beautiful painting of outback South Australia. As you can see, it's a very arid environment. He loved painting these very fragile landscapes, where you can simply look at it and you can see the dry, searing heat. It would be a very, very difficult place to make a living as a person, an animal, or a plant. And that's the sort of thing Hans loved to paint. Here's another one that Hans did. You can see this is the more traditional. This is going into the Australian bush tradition. You can see the trees there with the cattle in the background. It's a beautiful painting, very intimate, a brilliant use of colour. It's very vibrant. You can understand why Australians still love this type of painting so much, can't you? And then here's another thing that Hans did. And here's the first look at a Norah painting. So here's the painting by Hans Heysen, another semi-arid desert environment. Brilliant landscape painting. And here's a self-portrait painted by Norah of herself. Your first look at a Norah painting. So you can see the way they demarcated the lines. Father continued to paint the deserts and the landscapes, the desert landscapes and the gum trees. Norah went to still life and portraiture. So you can see this beautiful painting here on the cover of this book by Norah. I was really lucky when I was living in Melbourne before I had my Billy Blue, so I was very mobile. And I had, of course, I was a member of the National Gallery of Victoria down there at Melbourne. And I was very lucky while I was living down there in Melbourne and before I had my Billy, so I could get into Melbourne and go to things. The National Gallery of Victoria had this wonderful retrospective exhibition of both Hans Heysen and Norah. And it was just wonderful walking into this exhibition, room after room of Hans and seeing what the whole family had come from. All those, wonderful portraits. They really were portraits of these gum trees, growing against such dry difficulty, really struggling to make a living. He really painted that tortured existence of a gum tree. They're beautiful paintings. I still love them very, very much. But after going through all that, landscape painting of Hans, then you came to the last few rooms that were all about Norah. And you can see the relationship between father and daughter. And, as I said, it was a wonderful, loving relationship. Really interesting. And this is the book I bought while I was at that exhibition for Norah. I didn't buy a particular book of Hans. I obviously struggle a little bit still with the gum tree and the Bush Ballad School of Art, the orthodoxy. There's another beautiful self-portrait that Norah did when she was starting out and couldn't really afford sitters, of course, for her paintings. So she, like many young artists, she simply painted herself in the mirror because that's what she could afford. Here's another wonderful self-portrait by Norah. Wonderful thing, isn't it? You can almost see the influence even of Picasso, of Cubism, although her paintings, fitting in with Dad, because as I said, Dad was very conservative. He really did insist on very conservative, conventional artistic practice. So Norah, I think, would have found it really difficult to branch out into, anything too abstract, anything too modernist. She really would have struggled, I think, with her father. Her father was very loving, but he was also clearly very censorious. He really set the guidelines, the parameters of what should happen. I think Norah really struggled with that. When she became a war artist, it caused a bit of a ruckus in their family, apparently. Hans was not happy with that growth to independence at all. He really struggled with that and what he wanted for his daughter. But fortunately, Norah was obviously a very independent, wonderful, vibrant person, and so she went anyway. But yes, look at that wonderful still lifes again by Norah. Trying to get all the pages I've marked to show you here. I'm having trouble turning the pages. These pages don't want to open up at all. All right, here we have another wonderful self-portrait and another wonderful still life of the flowers in the vase, you can see. That's the sort of thing that Norah came up with. Look at the beautiful richness, the vibrancy in these still lifes of bouquets of flowers. Just magnificent use of colour, the beautiful, rich lyricism in these paintings, isn't there? Marvellous. You can see they're very conventional, they're very conservative type things. You can see the parameters laid down, the influence of her father again. Here are two beautiful, if you like, Madonna and Charles, contemporary Madonna and Charles that Norah did. She really loved painting this sort of thing. She really enjoyed the Madonna. Here's a few pieces from her work when she was a war artist. She particularly painted women. She was, the first one that really celebrated the role of women as nurses and as doctors, but particularly nurses, of course, during the Second World War. So there's one portrait she painted of a young Australian nurse. And here's another painting of a beautiful painting of an Australian nurse working in the pharmacy as a chemist. So she really was very, very good at, really looking at the, without being too much of a feminist herself, because she had that strong influence of her father all the time, and she did love her father. But when she became that war artist, she really was drawn to celebrating the role of women in the war effort. Really interesting. There's another two beautiful pictures by Norah. You can see again another type of contemporary Madonna and Child, and another beautiful bouquet of flowers. She was a wonderful artist, had this incredibly complicated relationship with Dad. They were clearly very loving. Dad was very nurturing, but yes, he was also very censorious and very heavy-handed in laying down the parameters of Norah's development. Fortunately, as I said, she was a very independent, strong-willed person herself as well. But I guess things must have been quite difficult at times. Very interesting. And because I have three daughters of myself, and all three of my, one is a painter and the other two are both writers, so I have a lot of these anxieties about my relationship with them as well, and whether they feel like they're working in my shadow and whether that's a problem, and because the loving relationship that I have with my kids is everything to me. So a lot of the anxieties that I saw in the relationship between Hans and Norah, I have in my own relationship with my three daughters as well. So when I went to this wonderful exhibition at the National Gallery of Victoria, I wrote this ekphrastic poem. Here's a poem that I've written called From Hans to Norah with Love. Trying to, write the poem from the perspective of Norah back to Hans. All right, here we go. Here's my ekphrastic poem celebrating the work, the world of Hans Heysen and Norah Heysen. From Hans to Norah with Love. I had a season ticket to a father's unfounded dread of a lockout from love, when what was intended as unconditional is felt as hurt, strings attached. I wanted an exhibition's curated fatherliness, bespoke nurture, all or nothing, picture perfect love. But what I got was award-winning lines of demarcation, landscape for him, portraiture and still life for her. A migrant success story, Hans made the Cedars his prosperous family homestead, the endowment of South Australia's fashionable, where the sun was therapeutic, rustic spirituality, and sinuous organic forms were an arts and crafts hallowed interior design, and solace was acquired in nurturing trees from tiny suckers to sturdy, closely knit bulk of old age. He instructed that conventional composition should shy away from experimentation as lacking discipline. Thus he embraced the daring ways of the copyist. Dutch masters, symbolism, and art nouveau. And his sense of proportion was praise for landscapes, monumental geometric shapes, the impulse to rugged, stifling heat. In his home, a daughter met monumental gums, fragrant bourbon roses, lilacs and irises, in the cosseted, overwhelming sublime. But father feared growing aghast at her maturity, venturesome enterprise in cosmopolitan self-portrait, a crumpled ambiguity in work trousers and army uniform, such meticulous French loosening and higher-keyed chicks. And her Archibald winning itch met bursting hubbub from a fraternity that knew everybody's place as she pitched curvaceous promise alongside the sway of emancipated vigour. Norah had no illusions of glory, but kept to the pure, delineated features of her sitter, luminous with pleasurable and productive, heroic hues in a match to an overshadowing, yet gentle, genial father. Interestingly enough, perhaps showing this real complicated relationship they have, I have never seen a portrait painted by Norah of Hans himself. And you think that would have been done at some time, wouldn't you? When she became such a well-known Australian, mid-20th. I guess Hans was sort of an early 20th century Australian landscape painter, and Norah was more a mid-century, even going into some of the later part of the 20th century, portrait and still life. But yes, that complicated, very loving, very nurturing relationship with her father. But I guess it was always complicated. And as I said, I have never seen a portrait painted by Norah of Hans. There you go. My world, my love affair with Hans Heysen and Norah Heysen. I love them to bits. And I also love the backstory of that complicated father-daughter relationship. All that nurturing love. But yes, it was also complicated. Thank you. And bye for now.